Okay, we are here today with Jacob Westra. Like I said, if you want to start, just kind of tell us about how you grew up and what year you were born, your parents.
Well, I was born in Kalamazoo, Michigan,
Okay.
November the 11th. No, November the 18th, I beg your pardon, 1918. And I spent most of my schooling in Kalamazoo. And then when I was about 17 years old, I had to leave home because this was in the period of the Great Depression.
Mm.
And I had to leave home to go find work. So what I did, I went up to the courthouse in Kalamazoo and I asked one of the ladies up there what kind of work they had for me. And she says to me, she said, "How would you like to go to camp?" Well, I said, "It all depends on what camp you're talking about." Well, she says, "We got a opening in the Civilian Conservation Corps."
Mm.
That's the CCs.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Where at?" She said, "East Tawas, Michigan." I said, "Well, that sounds like a winner." So she put my name down and took all the information. And she said, "I'll come and get you when we're ready for you." So I went back home and I told my folks, I said, "I'm leaving home." And I said, they wanted to know where I was going. And I told them, I said, "East Tawas, Michigan." Well, they knew where that was. And I said, "They got a CC camp up there." And I said, "I'm going there for a year." I said, "If I like it," I said, "maybe I'll sign up again for another year."
Mm.
So the lady came after me one day and we drove up to East Tawas. And I went into a camp called Camp Silver Creek. And I spent a year up there with them. That was a beautiful spot. I really liked that place, and I should have stayed.
Mm.
But in a way, I had my year in, I come back home, and then I worked on different projects.
Well, what kind of activities or work did you do at that camp?
Okay, in the CC camps, I was at first started planting trees,
Mm-hmm.
and after that, I was assigned to the ranger station at Camp Silver Creek Ranger Station. And I spent most of my time in the fire tower up there, which was 150 feet in the air. Of course, when the wind blew, it kind of swayed, you know. But it was fun up there. I enjoyed it up there. And I had a lot of company, a lot of people that came, you know, like tourists or something like that. They came up and visited me, and I couldn't have no radios and no books to read or anything like that. All I had to do was spot for fires in the woods,
Mm-hmm.
which was very neat. I had a pair of binoculars and a place called the round table with an azimuth here and a couple strings here. And then one afternoon, the phone rang. And here was another guy, I don't know, about 100 miles away. He called. And he said, "Have you spotted any smoke?" I said, "Where at?" He said, "Out by one of the lakes, what they call Long Lake."
Uh-huh.
I said, "No." He said, "Well then," he said, "turn around," and he said, "take your binoculars and scan out towards the Long Lake." So I did. I said, "Yep, I see this white smoke." He said, "Okay." He said, "Let's get a reading on it." And he says, "You know," he says, "that is a Girl Scout camp there." I thought to myself, oh boy. He says, "We don't know what kind of fire it is," but he said, "I can see the smoke." I said, "Yeah, I can see it too." So we got a reading on it. So then I called down to the ranger station and I give them the coordinates and everything. And I said, "All right." He said, "You stay right up there in that tower." He said, "Don't you dare to move out of there." And I said, "No, sir." I said, "I will not." So then they sent out a fire truck and also a bulldozer with a plow on the back end. And they got to the fire, and it was really going when they got there. So they called back to the ranger station, and the ranger station called up to me, and he said, "How bad do you think it is?" I said, "Well," I said, we can see a lot of smoke." Well, he said, "It's a bad fire." So he said, what we'll do is call some more camps for more manpower. But he said, in the meantime, he said, "You put the American flag that you got flying up there," he said, "you put that upside down." I said, "Upside down, sir?" He said, "Yes, upside down." I said, "What's that mean?" He said, "That means SOS. He said, "We gotta have more help on that." I said, "Okay," I said, "We'll do." Well, I never heard of a flag going upside down, you know. He said, "We had to put that upside down." And he says, "You stay up there." And he said, "If we need you, then you come down." And I said, "Okay, I will do that." So I stayed up there for a while, and pretty soon he called up there, and he said, "You come down." He said, "We need you down here." I said, "All right, I'll come down." So I closed the door and padlocked it and come down. So he said, "We're gonna take another pumper truck out there," and he says, "You're gonna be on it." I said, "Okay. It's okay with me." I said, "I can go." So I drove with the driver out to the Long Lake we went, and we had to evacuate them kids out there because, man, it was going. So we were on that one for 3 weeks. So that was something. So then after I came home, I worked on, different projects at home. And I got kind of bored. And I said, this is not for me. I said, I got to get away, up in the woods. So I went back to that lady and I said, "I got to leave Kalamazoo." She said, "Okay." She said, "There's a camp up in the UP." I said, "All right." I said, "Put me down for that." Well, she said, "That's way up." I said, "That's all right." I said, "I just want to get away and get back up in the woods." So this time I went by train up there. And I got off there and the Army truck was waiting for me and he told me, he said, "Jump in." He said, "Got to go up to camp." So we went to the camp. And I got my clothes and my bunk where I was supposed to sleep and everything. And I worked up there for a while, and I'm telling you, we had more fun than barrel monkeys. And this happened to be a lumberjack camp up there in Gibbs City, called Gibbs City. I'm telling you, when we got together with those guys, it was something else. We ended up in a fight with the lumberjacks, so got them guys squared out. And only one time we had to go on a fire call. And that wasn't a bad one, so that was all right. But we planted a lot of trees up there. And in fact, I think that one day we planted about 23,000 trees. And that was something. And the forester, he was well pleased. So you guys did a good job and everything. So I spent a summer and a winter there. In springtime, I came back home. And then the NYA started up. That was the National Youth Administration.
Okay.
So I asked the lady again about that school. She said, "Well," she said, "it's a forestry school at Michigan State." I said, "Oh, that sounds good." But she said, "It's not for long." She said, "About 16 weeks. I said, "Well, that gives me a foot, in the college." She said, "Well," she said, "if you want to go," she said, "we'll arrange it." So I told her, I would like to spend some time at the college. So I went to Michigan State, took forestry for, this is about 16 weeks.
Mhm.
So then I came back home, and then I thought to myself, hey, there must be another place up north someplace. So I went to see this lady again. And her name was Mary, and I told her, Mary, I gotta get away. She says, okay. She says, you know, she says, we got a camp right here in lower Michigan. She says, you ever hear of Grand Haven, Michigan? I said, no. I said, I don't even know where that's at. Well, she said, it's right on Lake Michigan. I said, you must be kidding. Well, she said, you've heard of Holland and Muskegon? I said, yep. Well, she said, it's halfway in between Holland and Muskegon. I said, well, then she told me, she says, I don't know. She said, maybe you won't like it, maybe you won't will like it. I said, well, just let me try it. So this was in 1939.
Okay.
So then I came to Grand Haven, and I fell in love with this town. Because it's by the lake, you know.
Uh-huh.
So I stayed. And there was rumors of war that was coming. So I thought to myself, now should I stay here or go back home? But no, I thought no. And then I met a girl here, so I said, yeah, better stay. So I stayed, and there was a bunch of guys that I got acquainted with, and they got together and we discussed about the situation, about the draft and everything. One guy pipes up, he said, nah, we don't want to be drafted. Well, what should we do? We're going to volunteer. Okay. So he says, volunteer for 1 year of service. That was the idea. 1 year. So, okay, we went down to the draft board and we told them, hey, we are volunteering our service for 1 year. Okay, we can do that.
Did you pick the Army for any particular reason?
No. Because, well, in the CCs, we were under Army jurisdiction, and
Okay.
also the Forest Service. But the Army had charge of us, like, we had physical training in the morning and drill in the morning.
Okay.
So that was, we knew that was something coming up, so we said, okay, Army down. So we signed up for the Army
And this is what year then?
1939.
Okay.
So we didn't have to go until 1941.
That's a long time ago.
Yeah, right.
What did you do in between?
Stayed right in camp.
Okay.
And in 41, we left Grand Haven, went by Kalamazoo, and I saw my dad and family. And then we got on a train and went to Fort Sheridan, Illinois.
Okay.
And from Fort Sheridan, we stayed for 2 weeks, and then we headed out for California. Went to Fort Ord, California, and that's where we did our basic training. And at that time, I was with what they call the Ordnance Department, and we had a lot of training in the Ordnance Works and everything. And then from then on, we went to a place called Stockton, California, where we had a depot, and then some of the supplies that were going overseas had to come through us. We had to inspect them, assemble them, put together, and guns we had to clean and get them ready to pack up and ship overseas. And then the orders came down that we were moving, so we started moving east. We didn't know where we were going. We ended up in Missouri at Fort Leonard, Missouri, and we stayed there for about a week. And then from there on, after that, we went to A.P. Hill, Virginia. And then from there, we went to North Carolina. And we did the Tennessee maneuvers and the North Carolina maneuvers. And then we came back to A.P. Hill. It was our staging area. And we got attached to some other companies. Come to find out, they were going to North Africa. So one morning, we were all lined up, ready to ship out to Newport News, to get on board the ship and head for North Africa. So one morning, we woke up and we looked out, you know, everybody was gone except our trucks and everything were all lined up, ready to go with them guys, you know. So, well, we were wondering what in the world's going on here. So then the captain came and talked to us. He said, I guess we're going to stay behind, you know, which was all right with us, but we stayed right there at A.P. Hill. And the other companies and that, they left, they got board on ship, and they took off and went to North Africa. And about a month later, we got word that that whole outfit was wiped out at Kasserine Pass in Italy, or Africa, I should say. So we were lucky. So then, wasn't too long, well, we had a lot of entertainment, like the USO and Duke Ellington's orchestra was there. He played for us and everything. And there was a bunch of whacks. They were from Michigan. We got acquainted with those girls, and we had a time with them. They were shipping out before us guys. So when the time came for them to ship out, we went over to their camp and bid them goodbye and everything, good luck, and they wished us the same. So they left. It wasn't too long before we got our orders to pack up and start for Newport News. So we did. We packed everything. We had our trucks and the whole works. We went on into Newport News and boarded the ship, and shoved it off and went to England.
Do you remember the name of the ship?
No, all I know, oh yeah, I do too. USS Argentina.
Okay.
That was a Brazilian passenger ship.
Okay, so how many people do you think were on it?
Oh God, I wouldn't know.
A real lot?
A lot of people did. In fact, the bunks they had down below were 4 high. So it took us a whole week to get across.
How was the trip? Was there a lot of people that were sick or
It
bad
was-
weather?
It was smooth. Well, we zigzagged and everything, counted the submarines and everything. And to top it off, I found me a good spot up in the ship's library, and I curled up in there and had my bedding and everything laying there, you know, and I curled up. The first sergeant came along and he says, "You found yourself a good spot, didn't you?" "You bet." And I said, "I'm not moving out of here until you guys tell me to." But the food down below was all right, but most of the guys, they didn't care to go down there because they got so doggone seasick, you know. And then up above, came aboard above, yeah, fresh air. That was the best remedy for them guys, was fresh air. And every day we had boat drill, counting, you know, submarines floating around there. But we got across safe. We landed in Liverpool, England. And then from there on, we went to a place called Ashchurch, England. That was about a half hour from Birmingham, England.
Okay.
And we came to Ashchurch. We took over a factory owned by the General Motors Company, where they made Chevrolets and that, but they turned it over to the War Department. That was our big depot. That was a big place. That was our depot. From then on, all the supplies that came to England came through us. No other place had the authorization to receive the war equipment from the United States.
And that, like, extras were stored in that factory then?
The factory was shut down.
Okay.
Everything had to be moved out,
Uh-huh.
and all of our supplies came there, like tanks and everything.
Mhm.
And we had one ordnance company there that all they did was assemble tanks. When we got done with inspecting the tanks and everything, they did all the work. And just like with trucks too. We got the trucks and everything, and inspected them, make sure all the parts are there and everything, the Jeeps and ambulances, anti-aircraft guns, you name it, we had it. And I was over there, we were over there for 2.5 years. And one day they moved us out in the field, then we knew where we were going. So,
Well, while you were in that factory area working there, did you often hear news about what was going on the lines, how the war was progressing, or you just focused on getting these supplies out?
just, we were focusing on getting the supplies, because D-Day wasn't on yet,
Mm-hmm.
but we knew something was coming up, because right behind us was the big bomber Air Force base, and every night them buggers would go flying over us, you know, and we knew it, we knew it. So then when June 6th came, that's when the invasion started. And then we knew we were ready to go. So sure enough,
So was it like 1943 then when you stopped working at that factory area?
about
Okay. And then where did you go?
in 44, that's when D-Day arrived, you
Mhm.
know, June 6th. So they put us on a big boat. They carried our trucks, we had semis, Jeeps and everything, and our supply vans and all that, you know. They put us on that boat. And we had to wait 10 days out there while the Battle of Normandy was going on. And when they moved inland further, then it was time for us to come in shore and set up our depot on the beach. And in the meantime, they found an orchard where we put our tents and dug our foxholes and everything, you know. And that was our base. That was only 2 miles from the beach. But we had to be careful because there was Germans floating around there, and, you know. And we had the captain told us, he says, "You guys be on the lookout." He says, "You never know who might show up in your area." So we did. We had guards all the way around. And every morning we'd go down to the beach and start inventory all of the supplies that came off those boats that were bringing them from England and that, you know. So, and that battle kept going on, and then when Paris was liberated, then they started up a line from our beach to Paris, which they called the Red Ball Express. They delivered all the supplies by semis. And that was quite a journey. I went with them just once, and we had a lot of fun. We had, especially with the MPs that were directing traffic. Them guys were crazy. So the divisions that were going inland further and further, they were losing men left and right. So one morning the order came down. I don't know who issued the order, but they were taking people from the quartermaster, Air Force, Ordnance Department, what have you, going to put them into the infantry, you know. So they sent us to Compiègne, France, where we had 3 weeks of infantry training. And they put us on boxcars and shipped us up to the front, through Belgium and Luxembourg. And I ended up in Germany. And I thought to myself, oh boy, what am I getting into? So we come to a place where they dropped us off They marched us up to where we were supposed to go. So I happened to get into the 78th Infantry Lightning Division. I was with the 310th Regiment, and Company E. And this lieutenant came out and talked to us. He told us, you guys are with a good company. He said, you're glad to be here with these older guys. He said, they know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So they went through the mill. He said, all you have to do is just listen to what they say and be careful. So we joined up with them. At that time, they were fighting for a city called Schmidt, and a great big dam was called Smanuel Dam. The Germans had control of that dam. They already had holes in that dam. The water was coming. They were trying to flood that valley out, so we couldn't get at them Germans, you know. But our engineers, they were wonderful. They just connected the wires and everything, and the troops went there and they captured the dam. But the city of Schmidt itself was a battle, a real battle, fierce. One day we took the town, next day they took the town.
Mm.
So it's back and forth, but finally the white flag came out and they surrendered, so that was neat. And then from there on we went through the valley, the R-O-E-R, that's the Roar Valley.
Okay.
And then we went, from there we went to another valley called the R-H-U-R Valley. And rivers all over the place.
Uh-huh.
So we fought along the Roar River. And we took the cities, great big cities of Wuppertal and Dusseldorf. In the city of Wuppertal, they had a monorail going across around the city. That's the first time I ever saw a monorail. So that was neat. And Dusseldorf was a place where they had factories where they were making munitions and all that stuff, you know. So we took that town, and in between time we took some more towns, just about the size of Grand Haven and Spring Lake combined. We fought and fought and fought. So we were wondering where the heck we were going. So the captain told us one day, he said, you know, he said, I don't know if I should tell you guys this or not, but he said, you know, he said, our plans are to capture a bridge. So, boy, a bridge. I asked the captain, I said, what river? He said, the Rhine River. Oh, boy, I thought, uh-oh. But he said, it'll be all right. He said, we can do it. I said, yeah, we can do it. So then, this particular afternoon, we were marching along, and all of a sudden, he called a halt. I told my buddy, I said, oh boy, what do you think? He said, I don't know. He said, we'll just wait to see what the captain says. So this lucky that he is binoculars, and he was trained down the road there, and he saw something move. He says, call the bazooka team up there, and you know, he says, I want you guys to get that. He says, get that SOB. I know. That's the first time we ever heard that captain cuss, because he was a preacher in Brandywine, Pennsylvania. So I said, well, I told my buddy, I said, did you hear what the captain said? Yeah, he said, you know, he said, that's the first time he ever swore. I said, oh, Lordy. And he said, told that bazooka team, he said, I want you to get that SOB. Now, just like that. So they fired one rocket, and I'm telling you, that went right in that object. And, oh man, it was just like a 4th of July. The shells were flying and explosions. He says, well, he says, you know, he said, that's one ammunition truck they won't be using.
Oh,
So I said, yeah, amen. So then, after the explosion ceased, we kept on going. And we kept going, kept going. Every time more towns and people were surrendering, you know, white flags hanging out of their windows and everything. So finally we came to a place, and he says, well, he said, we're just about to the Rhine River.
mhm.
I said, yep. I thought, that's so good. And I told my friend Charlie, I said, maybe we're gonna stop for the night. And the captain called a halt. He said, this is as far as we go for the night. He said, we're digging in. He said, we've walked long enough today. He said, well, we walked over 20-some miles that day. And he said, it's about time for a hot meal. He said, we've been eating K rations and C rations for I don't know how many days nor how many weeks. So we thought that was great. So we stopped, we dug foxholes and got in. In the meantime, the kitchen crew came up with a hot meal, which was really good. And we had a hot meal that day. And he also told the kitchen crew, he said, now in the morning, he said, I want a hot breakfast up here for these guys. He said, they've been on K rations and C rations long enough. He said, I want hot breakfast. Okay, yes sir, he said, okay, we'll do. So we were attached with the 9th Armored Division. They were spearheading for us guys. And somehow they got ahead of us, and they come to a city called Remagen, Germany. And they went around the corner down the hill light, and they spotted a bridge, a railroad bridge across the Rhine River at Remagen. So the captain of the tankers, he called his higher officer, and he says, told him, he said, we got a bridge down here at Remagen. He said, you got a bridge? Yep. Okay, he says, send a squad of your tankmen and a lieutenant across to go down there and see what it's all about. So, well, we didn't know, they didn't know what was going on either, and we didn't either. But anyway, they sent a squad down there, and they got about halfway down that hill. And the Germans must have knew that we were there, because they blew a big hole at the entrance of the railroad bridge, so nobody could get in there. But in the meantime, this higher officer called another officer that was higher than he was, and he told him, he says, we've got a bridge across the river. He says, asked if it was intact. Yep, nothing blown down or nothing. It's a railroad bridge. So he says, all right. He said, I'll call the general. So he called General Eisenhower, and he told General Eisenhower, he said, hop zickety zig, we got a bridge. He wanted to know where it was. He's Rhine, across the Rhine at Remagen, called the Ludendorff Bridge. Okay, he says, what's up there? Any troops? Yep, 9th Armored, 2 regiments of the 78th Division. Okay, he says, start moving them guys out of their holes. And this is about 4 o'clock in the morning. They woke us up with whistles blowing and shouting, and what in the world's coming off here? So the sergeant says, get out of your holes, back up. He says, we got a bridge across the Rhine River. Oh boy, good enough. So we jumped out of our holes and got ready. So no hot breakfast that morning.
Yeah.
So then we went down, started down the road. We come to a big church. It was up on a plateau like, and underneath by the church there was a tunnel from that church to the city of Remagen. So we had to go through that tunnel, and our lieutenant says, drop your packs. So I thought, we drop our packs? Yep, got to drop them. So we dropped our packs, and we had bandoliers of rifle shells and that, hand grenades and everything. So he said, we gotta start walking down to the bridge. Well, here we, I thought to myself, I told Charlie, I said, here we go. And we started down. In the meantime, this platoon of 9th Armored guys, they got on the bridge. They started out, about halfway, they stopped. And the doggone bridge blew up a little bit. So the dust and everything and smoke, you know. So we watched that. And he said, let's see what happened to the bridge. So the dust settled, smoke settled, and that bridge went right slowly down on its pillars. It didn't go down the river. Good. And then everybody was yelling, go, go, go. So the engineers were underneath there cutting the demolition wire so the Germans couldn't blow them anymore, you know. So we started across. Our tanks too, they started. And then our captain told us too, he said, before you guys cross, he said, I want you to do one thing. He said, I want you guys to grab each other's belt in the back and hang on for dear life. But he said, no one. He said, no one, period. He said, don't want to lose their grip on each man's belt, because he said, if you do, you're going down in the Rhine River. And he said, you don't want to go down there, because he said, it's cold. Mm-hmm. And so we hung on for dear life. But boy, I'm telling you, they were shooting at us from all angles on that bridge. They had rifle fire, machine gun fire, and even artillery fire. The bombs are hitting the girds. You can see them bouncing off, the sparks and everything, you know. Well, I'm telling you, it was something. But anyway, we started across, and then we found out where those guys were. They were up in the hills. So when we got across, the captain yelled, he says, all right, he said, the 311th Regiment go left. He said, the 310th, that's us, go right. Good. They went that way, we went that way. They had to go up that hill to capture that machine gun nest and everything. And you know, they tried everything under the sun to get rid of that bridge. They sent their Air Force, what was left of it, to bomb it out. And you know, that day was the first time we ever heard of a jet. He come flying right by us. Swoosh, just like that. Oh, what was that? He said, that was a jet. I said, you must be kidding. He said, I didn't know they had a jet. So they're just perfect. One jet. The other airplanes were propeller jobs. But anyway, our anti-aircraft fire, every time they came over, they blasted them out of the sky. And they were sending frogmen down the river, trying to blow a river bridge. But our sharpshooters up there, they were picking them off just like ants. So that discouraged that. But anyway, the 311th, they went up the hill, and we took off, went to a little city called Herbal. And that's where we found a couple high-off German officers laying in a ditch. They were scared. They were really scared. And I don't blame them. They were really fired on. They came out with their hands up. Of course, you had to take them back to the lines for irrigation with the other our high officers we had. So then we kept going, and we came to another town. This time we had to do a little fighting, but we made it in this town called Koningswetter. That was kind of a resort town. And we took that town, and then we did an about face and come back towards the bridge. And in the meantime, the 311th, they were having a heck of a time up there on the ridge, on the mountainside there, because they had gun emplacements up there with Germans. They were shooting at them, you know, and everything. But they finally got the white flag flying, and they got enough prisoners, shipped them back down. So they came down, and we all banded together and started going toward the big Germany itself. So I think today that capture of that bridge helped shorten the war over there, because it was some. And we took a lot of villages and farm villages and stuff like that. So we were up there for 128 days. So finally we come to a place called Korbach, Germany. And the order came down, he said, 310 and 311, stop, right here. This is as far as you guys go. And I thought, oh boy, we're gonna have a rest now. Yep. So there was 5 German hospitals there, full of wounded soldiers, also American wounded was in there. We've come to find out that they were there too. So we had to help guard those Germans, and took care of the Americans. We got them out of there and put them in our own hospital, you know. So after a while, they were going to move the troops again. And I thought to myself, no, don't move the troops yet. This is too good of a place. They had a nice park and everything, you know. So then the order came down. All the troops start totaling up their points. I thought, well, points, yeah. They were going home. The guys with the highest points were going home. So I sat down with Charlie. We figured out our points. I told Charlie, I said, you got enough points, Charlie? Yeah. He said, you? I help. He said, we're going home. I said, amen. I said, we've had enough of this fighting and everything. And I said, I'm getting so sick and tired of K ration and C ration. I said, I'm ready for a home cooked meal. So it was a while before we got our notice that we were going home. So and then the order came down. Everybody had their duffel bags. And I saw and Charlie says to me, he says, hey, he says, aren't you going home? I said, yeah, it's my time to go. He says, where's your duffel bag? I said, duffel bag? Yeah. He says, well, I said, it's in the service department. Well, he said, you're supposed to go home with us. So I hurry up and run to the first sergeant. I said, First Sergeant, I said, aren't I supposed to go home? He looked on the rush. He says, oh my God. He said, yeah. He said, you're supposed to go. He said, run to the supply sergeant and get your barracks bag. He said, man, he said, the trucks are all lined up and ready to take you guys to a different outfit. So, man, I took out of there. I left my rifle and my helmet and my canteen and the whole works. I left that behind. I grabbed my duffel bag. I said, let's see you guys later. I said, goodbye. I hurried up and got to the trucks, and Charlie helped me aboard. And he says, man, he said, I didn't think he was going to make it. I said, I didn't either. I said, that doggone first sergeant, I said, if I see him in civilian life, I'll talk to him like a father. So we got to a different camp. So then our time came, and I said, Charlie says, we're going to go to Paris. I said, oh boy, I hated Paris. I hated that town.
Why did you hate it?
Because the people weren't friendly to us. The people in Normandy and Belgium like that, they were friendly because they went through all that bombing and all that stuff, you know. But Paris, I don't think they liked the Americans. But anyway, we ended up in Camp Lucky Strike. So Charlie says to me, he says, you know, he says, we got a delayed en route furlough coming to England. I said, that's right. I said, we're going to spend 14 days in England. But I said, in the meantime, I said, I know my old companies here in Paris. I said, I'm going to find out about them guys. So I walked in the office there to the signal corps telephone exchange, and I said, "You got a company called 185th Ordnance?" He said, "Just a moment." He said, "Let me look in the book." So he looked in the book, yep. He says, "You want me to call him?" I said, "Yep." I said, "You call him." So he rang him up and he handed the phone to me. And he said, this guy on the other end says, "This is Chief Warrant Officer Manglady." He says, "Who am I talking to?" And I said, "This is Jacob Westra." He says, "Oh, Lord," he says, "where are you at?" I said, "I'm in Camp Lucky Strike." He said, "You sit still." He said, my Jeep and I will come and pick you up." And he takes you back to the company. He said, "I know you want to see your old guys again." I said, "I sure do." So it was about 5 minutes later, he was there. And I asked the sergeant at the desk, I said, "Is it okay to go, Sergeant?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "We know where you're at." And he said, "In case you have to come back in a hurry because your ship's leaving for England," he said, "we'll come call you." And he said, "They can bring you back in a hurry." I said, "Yeah." I said, "They're only 5 minutes away." So he came and he said, "You ready to go?" I said, "Yep." And he said, "Well, jump in the back seat of the Jeep." And he said, We'll take off." So came to the old company. And I went around talking to all the old guys I knew, and they were glad to see me. And I talked to them. I said, "Yeah." One of the mess sergeant says, "You going home, Jake?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "I got enough points." So then the officers came out, the captain and the lieutenant. He says to me, he says, "Private Westra," he says, "can I ask you a question?" I said, "What's that?" He said, "How come you got the red tag and the white tag on your jacket?" I said, "You want to know?" He said, "You weren't wounded or nothing." I said, "No." I said, "You want to know why?" I said, "Because," I said, "I'm flying home." Well, he said, "That's pretty good." He said, "You're flying home." And he said, "I'm going home by boat." Well, I said, "You know, Captain," I said, "you did us guys a favor when you pushed us out of your company and got us into the infantry." I said, now we're getting rewarded by flying home." Well, he said, "Where are you going from here?" I said, "We got a 14-day furlough in England." He said, 14-day in England? I said, "Yeah." I said, "We got a 14-day furlough." He said, "Boy," he says, "you guys are living like little kings." I said, "Yep." I said, "Thanks to you." I don't think he liked that very well. He walked away. He didn't say no more to us. And I thought to myself, and I told my other buddies that when I got back, I said, I said, "I don't think the captain liked the idea that I'm flying home." I said, "But I told him what I thought." He said, "Good for you, good for you." He said, "He didn't like it, did he?" I said, "No, because," I said, "he's going home by boat." And I said, "I'm flying home." So, and I happened to know before we left England, I met a family over there. And that was my home, away from home. Whenever I had a furlough or time off from my duties, I spent some time with her. And this man, he was a sergeant major in the British War, World War I. And he knew what I was going through. So he told me, he said, and even his wife, he said, and his daughter was there. Before that, she was only 15, 16 years old. They had evacuated her because they was in the Blitz, bombing the city of Birmingham, and bombing Coventry, which they blasted smithereens. And she says, both of them told me, and the daughter agreed. She said, "Whenever you have time off," she said, "you come here." She said, "This is your home, away from home." I said, "Well, I appreciate that." So I said, "No," I said, "I'm here on a 14-day furlough." And I said, "I've got ration tickets for my use." But I said, "I'm going to give them to you." What she said, "You'll use them." I said, "No," I said, "I'm going to give them to you." I said, "You use them." I said, "You can use them more than I do." Well, she said, "What can I get you for breakfast or anything?" I said, "Just get me some ham and eggs and bacon." I said, "That's all I need, and a cup of coffee." which they did. They were good. I spent 14 days with them. And we had more fun than barrel of monkeys. When we went all over, they took us to places I never dreamt of going to places, you know. And this daughter says to me too, she said, you know, he said, if you ever come back to England, he said, be sure and look us up. I said, I will do that. So in the meantime, when I got home, I wanted to go back to Penn State.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to go to the forestry school there. And my first wife says to me, she said, no, she said, you've been gone long enough. She said, it's time you stay home with your daughter, your little daughter, and spend time with her. I said, okay. I said, that's the way it is. I said, that's the way it's got to be. So I spent time with them, you know, and everything. And meantime, I got acquainted with the 78th Infantry Division Association. And they had reunions, and I went to them. And in the meantime, I got divorced from my first wife. And then I was working at the Challenge Machinery at that time. That's where I met my second wife. So we got married and that. And I told her, I said, I belong to the 78th Infantry Division. I had a lot of reunions. She said, I can go to them. I said, yeah. I said, you can go to them. So that's what we did. And one time we went to Omaha, Nebraska for a reunion. And there was a man there. He was an association member of our division. And he had belonged to a travel. He had a travel bureau. And he come up with an idea for a battlefield tour
Mm-hmm.
of, you know, in Europe. And I said, well, I told my wife, I said, you want to go? She said, yeah. She said, I want to go and see where you guys were. So we signed up. We went on that one. And that was for about 10 days, which was neat, but it wasn't like I wanted to be, you know. So it wasn't long when we was in Louisville, Kentucky. This guy come up and he says, you know, he said the 50th anniversary of D-Day is coming up. He said, I'm going to have a battlefield tour. But in the meantime, I found another tour that was going to last for a whole month. This was, his tour is going to just last so many weeks. So I told the wife, I said, I'm going to sign up for that one in Florida, which was the best idea I ever had. So I signed up with them. And while they rode back and forth and everything, you know. So finally, time came, they sent my airline tickets, everything. And we left from St. Louis, Missouri. Flew over to Paris. This is 1948, June the 6th,
Okay.
right on D-Day. So we got to Paris, and got our luggage and got our buses, and he took us to our hotel. And we were the last hotel on Normandy. We call ourselves the outpost. The rest of them are right around the circle there, you know. But our hotel was the outpost. Everything had to come through the outpost. That's where our tour directors were living and everything, the bus drivers. So we had a good time there. So come Normandy, we spent a week on Omaha Beach, looking at the beaches and everything, you know. And had a big ceremony there. I'm telling you, there were everybody and his brother was there. The Queen of England, the Queen of Holland, the Duke of Luxembourg, President Clinton and his wife, the President of France and his wife, all the dignitaries, the allies that fought in World War II. So they came and they had a big demonstration. They had warships out in the bay, and they were firing their cannons. And they had a demonstration of landing at Omaha Beach. That was neat. That was super. So So then they had, of course, they had speeches, and then they had a flyover with all the Air Force planes from World War II. That was nice. And then speeches by the President, by the Queen of Holland, she had to speak. And then they had a parade of all the Allies. Different band, had the United States Army band there, the whole band. And they had the British band, the Canadian band, Belgian band, French band, and they had all march by us guys. We were special people. The senators and all the rest of the high monkeys, they had to sit up above us. A couple of senators come by us. This one thing, Senator Dole, he came by and stopped and shook hands with us and talked, you know. Pretty soon here comes Senator Sam Nunn strolling up the aisle. He looked, all right, he says, before I go up above you guys, he says, I'm getting a seat right here, and he says, I want to talk to all of you guys. So he sat there, and I'm telling you, he talked with us, asked us questions and everything, you know. And finally he says, well, he says, the ceremony, I think, is about ready to begin. He said, I better go up and see the other guys. I said, we told everybody said, no, stay with us. This is the best seats in the house. Yeah, he said, I realize it's the best seats in the house, but he said, I got to get upstairs. So that's what he did. But then he spent some time up there, and then some of the senators did come down and talk to us. So we saw the parade and everything. Then we had to go back to the beaches. And we visited the big cemetery they got up there with all the American soldiers. Well, I'm telling you, that was the most emotional day I ever spent, was at that cemetery, realizing how many lives were lost going on that beach, you know. So it was time to say goodbye. But we also, before we said goodbye, we visited Omaha Beach, or not Omaha, but Utah Beach, and spent some time there at their museum. And then some of the people had to leave to catch their flights back to LA and all that places, you know. And then we had to catch a train out of Paris for Munich, Germany, because we were going to Remagen, back to Remagen, Germany, to see the bridge and everything. Mm-hmm. So we said goodbye to our friends and everything. They were going back home also. So we left Paris on a train, headed for Munich. Got to Munich, and waited for the train for Remagen. In the meantime, there's two Australian girls. They were hiking across Germany. So then they asked us where we were going. We said, Amsterdam. Okay, we were going to the same place. That's good. But I said, we got to get off at Remagen. I said, you ever hear of Remagen? Yep. I said, well, that's a bridge. And then they wanted to know about the bridge, so we had to talk to them about the bridge. So then we got to Remagen, and our hotel was just about a block away from our railroad station. So we went over there and told the guys behind the desk there, they were brothers, told them we were up, got your rooms all up, all reserved. All right. Now he says, go upstairs, get rid of your stuff, and then come down and have the evening meal with us. So that was okay. And he said, in the morning, he says, come down for breakfast and everything. They all served. So we went up, got refreshed and everything, come down and had supper. And we went upstairs and went to sleep. Man, we were tired. So next morning we got up, had breakfast, got down there. Right here is a table. There was an old gentleman and his wife. He was jolly as could be. He looked at me, he says, World War II veteran? I said, yes, sir. He said, I too. I said, you were? He said, yep. He said, I was in a Scottish outfit, the tankers. He says, where were you? And I told him. He said, you Remagen? I said, you bet. Well, he said, he said, I want to hear all about Remagen. He said, we're going to spend a few days here. And he said, I want to see the Remagen and also the museum they had there. They had a nice museum, you know. So I told him, I said, that's good. And he said, my son from Germany's driving up to visit me. He said, I want you to meet him.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, okay. I said, you tell me when he's coming. I said, we'll be down. He said, we'll be down by the river. I said, all right. I said, we'll be down there. So he told me when his son was going to come. So next day we went down there, met his son and everything, talked about the bridge and everything. And his son said, well, he said, told his dad, he said, I want to go up to see the bridge, see what it looked like. And he said, oh, I also heard they had a nice museum there. I said, absolutely. I said, they got a nice museum up there. So, and then I got a letter from my people that were living in the Netherlands. They wanted to see us.
Mm-hmm.
So I told my wife, I said, oh, this is going to do something here. I said, listen, I think we can spend 10 days in the Netherlands. So in the meantime, she called and says, my daughter and her husband is going to come to Remagen with the car and pick you up. I said, when? And she told me, yeah, I said, all right. So that afternoon, one of the afternoons, they came in the car. I said, you spend the night here at the hotel with us. So I went down and made reservations for a room. Mm-hmm. Man at the hotel said, absolutely. He said, they came from the Netherlands to pick you up. He said, we got room. He said, in fact, he said, if we had a room upstairs, we'll take them to the apartment. They had a big complex there, you know. So I said, that's good. So I told Betsy and her husband, I said, he's going to spend the night. I said, you have supper with us and everything? Yep, okay, we'll spend the night. So they did, and we went down to the Rhine River and watched the boats and the lake barges and everything. So the next morning, we got up, but in the meantime,
Okay, we left off at the hotel and having dinner.
Yeah, at the hotel, right. So that evening, we went down, and there was a bunch of British tourists there. Mm-hmm. And they were playing bingo, so they wanted us to join in to play bingo, so we did. We played bingo with them, and I told our British friends, I said, well, I said, better go upstairs and get some sleep. And yeah, got to go upstairs. So I told them, good night, see you tomorrow. So in the morning, we all went down and had breakfast. And we had a ball with that couple. So they wanted to know where we lived, and I told them Grand Haven, Michigan. They wanted to know where that was. I said, on Lake Michigan, between Holland and Muskegon, not too far from Chicago. And they told me where they lived. So he says to me, he says, you know, he says, I want you to keep writing.
Uh-huh.
I said, will you answer my letters? Yep. He said, I'll write to you. So we got home. But in the meantime, I said, you know, I said, I have to meet my cousin's daughter and husband. Well, I met them too, because they came, we were ready to leave. He said, I told Betsy and Len, I said, I want you to meet some British friends of ours. I said, they're anxious to meet you. So they met them, and I told them, I said, we are leaving right now for the Netherlands. He said, we'll have a good time. Remember now, keep writing. I said, I will. He gave me his address and everything, you know. So we went to the Netherlands and spent 10 days with my people that I knew. And before that, my dad asked me when I came home, he says to me, he says, where were you? I said, Holland, Luxembourg, Belgium. He said, were you in Holland? I said, yeah. He said, why didn't you stop and see your 5 cousins? I said, Dad, I said, now you tell me, I had 5 cousins there. I said, I didn't know that. I said, if you told me before, I said, I would have stopped when we were in Holland. Well, anyway, we went over, so I spent some time with them, and we went all over Holland. So then one day, I told my one cousin, I says, Anna, I said, I gotta call the airport and make sure they confirm my reservations for Birmingham, England. Well, she says, my husband will do that. So she told him, she says, call the airport, confirm Jake's and Nancy's reservations for Birmingham, England. So he did. He says, you're all set. I said, thank you. And I says, and then she says, Len and Bessie's going to come after you the next day, next afternoon. I said, okay. I said, we'll be ready. So next day in the afternoon, when they came after us about 1 o'clock, and we got to leave, and I'm telling you, that was a hard part to leave her, because man, she busted out crying. I told her, Anna, I said, everything is going to be all right. Yeah, but she says, you know, she says, you're in America and I'm way over here. She says, I'd like to see you once in a while. I said, don't worry about it. I said, there'll be times when we'll be able to make it over here again to see you and everything. But it wasn't meant to be. So we got in the car and she was waving and the tears rolling all right. And I was looking out the back window waving at her, you know. And I thought to myself, boy, oh boy. Too bad we'd had to leave. And I said, and I thought to myself, it's too bad we live so far away. So we got to the airport. I found out where our plane was going to leave and everything. And I told Betsy, I said, no, I said, whatever you do, I said, don't you cry. So time came for us to board the plane for Birmingham. We walked down the aisle to the boarding gate, and she started the tears, you know. I said, oh, come on now. I said, I told you not to cry. So I said, it'll be all right. Well, she said, Jake, she said, I promise you one thing. She said, when you're in America, she said, Len and I are going to come and see you. I said, promise? She said, I promise. I said, okay. I said, I'll keep the promise. She said, all right. Now she said, I won't cry no more. And she said, have a good flight to Birmingham. I said, you bet. And I said, it'll be all right. So we got aboard the ship and we buzzed off the front of Birmingham. Landed, sure enough, there was the daughter and her husband came pick us up. So they took us to their house, had a little lunch, and he took us to the hotel where we were going to stay for a week. And I'm telling you, when we saw our rooms, you wouldn't believe it. Everything was in gold plated, faucets and everything. I said, holy moly. I thought to myself, what kind of place is this? So she said, you know, she said, I think you got the suite for the higher ups. I said, must be. Well, anyway, she said, enjoy it. I said, okay, so we did. But she said, now, she said, I'm going to tell you something. She said, you don't call us. But she says, every morning, she says, we will be here at the hotel to pick you people up. And she says, we are going to take you places where nobody's never been before. And she said, you know, she said, have you ever heard of the Cotswolds? I said, yep. She said, that's the most beautiful spot in England. I said, absolutely. Well, she said, you know, during the war, she said, I was evacuated to the Cotswolds. And she said, I landed at a beautiful home, a mansion. And she says, you never guess who it was. She said, it was General Esme and his wife and family. And he was the chief of staff to Winston Churchill. I said, boy, I said, you were lucky. And she says, I went to school in Stanton. She says, I went to church in Stanton. She says, I sang in the church. And she says, I danced with all the Canadian soldiers. I said, I figured you would be dancing. And she says, we'll go from town to town. She says, you'll be surprised. So that's what they did. Every morning, they came and got us. Every night, brought us back to the hotel. And for once out of the week, that we had a bunch, you know, had a time with them. And they had a son and a daughter and a little small baby girl. And the last Sunday we were there, I took them all out for lunch. That was really super. And their son presented me with a big book. And I told him, I said, you didn't have to do that. He said, we talked amongst ourselves and we bought this book for you. He said, I know you'll enjoy it. It was all about World War II and everything, you know. I thanked him for that. I packed it in my suitcase that night. And then we spent some time with the daughter and her husband. Her husband was in the RAF during the war. He was a weatherman stationed over in the Azores in Africa, by Africa, you know. So we got to talking about everything. And so the daughter says to me, she says, we got your flight number and everything to go back. And she says, we got to get up early in the morning. I said, what time are you early? Well, she says, we've got to get up at 3 o'clock. And she said, you don't have to get up at 3, but she said, you got to be ready by 5 to catch a bus from there to London, to Heathrow. I thought to myself, oh boy, you people are something else. By George, they were there. They got us on the plane and everything, or on the bus for Heathrow. Got to Heathrow. So we had check our baggage and go through customs and everything, and that was a riot. And had to be screened and everything. So we just got into the waiting room there, and great big 747 rolled up to the gate. I told my wife, I said, Nancy, I said, you know what you're riding in? She said, no. I said, look outside. She said, 747. I said, yep. I said, 747. So it was a while. We had some time to spend rolling around in Heathrow. So we spent some time in Heathrow rolling around. Pretty soon it was time to board the 747. So we got on board the ship and backed out of there, took off for home, landed in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That was the hub for Northwest. So she says, where do we fly from here? I said, fly to Muskegon. To Muskegon? I said, yeah. So we flew from Muskegon and come home. So, I was glad that we could spend some time over there and everything, you know. Well, then it just kept on going, and of course the World War II memorial was being thought of and everything. So we got to get correspondence on that. But in the meantime, before they even thought about it, we had a memorial service over in Remagen because we had a big plaque to put up on the bridge museum. So we had to go over there and present that plaque to the museum. We had a big ceremony over there. Then we had to come back. And then we got to talking about the World War II memorial. So we became charter members of that. And then the day came for the World War II memorial to be dedicated. But I didn't go to that one. I thought to myself, nah. I said, there'd be so many people there. I said, that rat race and everything, you know. I said, no, I'll stay away. So I had a couple of tickets, and I gave my tickets to a former Legion member and his wife. I said, I got these tickets. I said, do whatever you want with them. Well, he said, I'll give them to some of my buddies. He said, they'll be able to go. I said, all right, good. I said, one of these days we'll make it up there. So then they had the dedication and everything. He came back and told me, he said, whatever you do, he said, go see that. He said, that's awesome. I said, all right. So we got to the Orchard View Travelers Association out of Orchard View. And they send out a brochure every once in a while. So we got that, and I looked, and I said, told Nancy, I said, hey, I said, we can go to Washington. I said, here's a bus trip to Washington D.C. I said, he'll come right here to Grand Haven and pick us up. Oh, she said, okay, she said, sign up. Which we did. We signed up for Orchard View. Went to the Washington, Arlington, and all the monuments. Then we came to World War. But our bus driver tour says, you know, he got aboard. He says, got the mic, and he says, ladies and gentlemen, he says, I realize we're late, but he says, you know, he says, to do you justice for seeing this World War II monument, he says, how about if we come here early in the morning, right after breakfast? He said, does everybody agree to that? That was all right. Okay, he said, early in the morning, our first stop after breakfast will be the memorial. So next morning we got up and had breakfast and got ready to go bail out, you know, our hotel rooms, got on that bus. The bus driver took us right to the main gate. He said, this is as far as I'm allowed to go. He said, one side of the monument is the Pacific, the other side is the European theater. He said, I think most of you guys will be going to the European theater. And I thought to myself, good. So we started up down the ramp on the European side. And the first thing that got my attention was all those gold stars on there. That was for, I don't know how many American lives that were lost during the battle of, you know, Normandy and that. And I walked in there, and that's when I broke down. Man, the tears just rolled in my eyes. And the lady come up to me and says, Jake, she said, everything will be all right. I said, I know. But I said, seeing them stars, I said, you can't forget. But she said, no, she said, don't ever forget. I said, no way. But I said, I'll be all right. So then Nancy came up, and she grabbed a hold of me. She said, come on away from here. She said, I want to show you something. So we walked down, further down, and she showed me the battlefields. She said, here's Remagen. I looked down there, and I said, sure enough, Remagen Bridge. So I said, oh boy. So our tour director, he come down there, and he said, this where you were, Jake? Yep. I said, okay. He said, I want a picture of that. So he got his old camera going, took a picture of us. And in the meantime, there's another gentleman from our outfit. He came over, and his name was Art. He said, I want to take a picture of you too, standing right here. And I said, okay. I said, Art, come on. I said, they want pictures taken. So we got there and stood in front of the Remagen plaque there. And they took pictures, and then this lady came up and she says, can I take your picture of you two? She said, yeah. She says, all right. So she took a picture of us. And she says, you know, she says, we are going to have a little get together. And she says, I'm going to make up something for you too. She wouldn't tell us what it was. So after we made the tour of that, then we started making Arlington again, you know, and all those places that we wanted to see. So then we went to Mount Vernon and spent some time up there with George Washington in his home. And finally, the time came, I had to leave. So then we stopped at a place for lunch or for dinner, and we had a nice meal there. We started out and through Pennsylvania. We had to stop for overnight. We did. Came back to Michigan, left the people off at Muskegon, Grand Haven, and Holland. So it wasn't a couple of weeks later, got a notice in the mail from John that we're going to hold a little powwow for us guys. And all the pictures that they took and everything, they will all be laid out for us. And this lady had something. She had it all wrapped up, I'm telling you. So we had our meal. They had a potluck, or you might say. We were eating all and got done with that. And then we started looking at pictures and exchanging pictures and all that. And then this lady got up and she says, before everybody leaves, she said, I've got a presentation to make to Arthur and Jake. She said, I want you two guys to stand up. She said, I'll come right to you. And she had two things in her hand, two packages in her hand. Art says to me, he says, what do you think, Jake? I said, I don't know what she's got planned. But anyway, she came up and she presented them. Now she says, I want you to open them two packages up. So we opened them up, and what she did, she took that picture and she had it blow it up. Mm-hmm. And she put that picture that was blown up in a picture frame, and she bordered all the little pictures of the monuments and everything around her, and she had stuck a kind of a red, white, and blue bouquet with an American flag on top of it. Well, boy, I thought, well, thank you. But she said, you know, she said, there's going to be an article in the paper, and she says, and also an article in the Orchard View paper. And she says, I want you guys to get a copy of that. Mm-hmm. So it was in the paper, Muskegon Chronicle and also Orchard View, and she sent us both a copy of that. And I still got it on my desk. It doesn't move. Nothing moves. So the wife says to me, she says, you're going to keep that, aren't you? I said, you bet. I said, that goes in the den, and I said, there ain't nobody going to move that or take that away from me. But you know, I'll tell you one thing. While we were over friends, we had to stop off the city of conference. And that was just 75% destroyed by the bombers. Mm-hmm. The only thing that was left standing was part of a church. Mm-hmm. And the crucified picture or monument of Christ was there. And when we went in there, they were holding communion. And the priest came out and talked to us guys, and he gave us the history of that. I thought, wow, that's really something. And then we had to go into the city of itself, a great big hall. And while we were there, the mayor and all the dignitaries were there, and they had us all lined up in 2 rows, stretching from end to end of that hall. And they presented us a gold medal, each of us, for liberating the people of his city and liberating the people of Normandy from the Nazis. And I thought that was really nice. And everybody that had got one, boy, they pinned that right to their blouse right away, you know. And this tour director, she came up, she said, looked at it, she said, you guys can be proud of that. She said, keep it. Mm-hmm. She said, don't lose it. No. So I told the wife, I said, that's going into this little metal box, wrapped in cotton. I said, when I pass away, I said, that goes right on my uniform. I said, remember that now. Well, she know, I'll remember that. She says, put it where I can get at it. I said, it'll be there. I said, nothing will move. Well, she said, what about your other medals? I said, my other medals could go to my son. I said, I know my daughter won't care for him, but I said, my son will care for him, because I said, he was in the Marines. I said, they'll go with him. And she said, anything else goes with you? I said, my American Legion hat. I said, with all my battlefields and commissioner, everything goes. And that medal, I said, don't forget that medal. Oh, no, she said, I won't. She said, in fact, she said, I won't touch nothing in the den that belongs to you. So that was it. That's all I had to say. And that's all farther I can go, I guess.
Okay.